Hello, my name is Eric Hintz, and I'm a historian with the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. I'd like to welcome everyone to the fifth and final session of our week-long webinar series on Black inventors and innovators, New Perspectives. A brief program note, I'll be moderating today's session and filling in for our Lemelson Center Director, Arthur Demrich, who had a late breaking change to his schedule. Before I introduce the session and our speakers, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items and the mechanics of how we'll run the Zoom webinar. The upper right corner of your Zoom screen has a small square and some dots that say view. We would recommend selecting the speaker view. That will maximize the speaker's slides on your screen. And once we switch to our panel, you may want to change that to panel view. Please use the Q&A feature in the control panel that runs across the bottom of your Zoom screen to pose questions for our panelists. Questions will come to me, the moderator, and I will try to get to as many of your questions as time permits. And you can start posting those questions now or at any time. Please use the chat feature to share your observations and engage in conversation with your fellow attendees. There is a drop-down box, and we encourage you to share your observations with both the panelists and the audience. Also, please select the closed caption button if you'd like to view the live CART transcription of the webinar. Finally, we are recording this session, but please be assured we are not recording you at home or in your office. Attendees' microphones will be muted and your cameras will be disabled during the webinar. Please note that after some captioning and post-production, we do plan to post these videos of the sessions to the event website and to the Lemelson Center's YouTube channel in early December. So, as I mentioned, the Lemelson Center is located within the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The center was founded in 1995 thanks to the philanthropic support of the inventor Jerome Lemelson and his family. And we'd especially like to thank the Lemelson Foundation in Portland, Oregon for its sponsorship of this webinar series. Now in our 25th year, the Lemelson Center strives to educate and empower the public to participate in technological, economic, and social change. We do this through our museum exhibitions, our hands-on and virtual educational initiatives, and public programming like this. Indeed, one of our very first public programs was a 1996 symposium that explored technology and the African American experience, which provided impetus to new collecting initiatives and scholarship on this important topic. And we've been so excited to extend that work during our webinar series all this week. So now I'll invite our two speakers to turn on their video so we can kick off today's session. In terms of format, I'll just say a few words about today's themes. We'll have each speaker give a brief presentation. We'll have Charlton McIlwain go first, then André Brock. The three of us will engage in a few minutes of dialogue, and then we'll take up the audience's questions. I'll conclude the session in the webinar series by thanking several folks and making some announcements about future Lemelson Center programming. And as I mentioned, this is the fifth and final session of our week-long webinar series. During our earlier sessions, we have focused largely on Black inventors and innovators, the people who design, develop, and deploy new technologies. In today's session, we'll shift that focus a bit from Black innovators to Black technology users, and I guess we could even trouble some of those categorizations. Today, we'll explore how Black individuals and communities have experienced technology. So in terms of a description of this session, historically, we know that many Black people have experienced technology from Atlantic slave ships, the cotton gin, and predictive policing algorithms. They've experienced technology as the material expression of discrimination, oppression, incarceration, and violence. However, on the other hand, Black Americans have also deployed technologies to promote education, social justice, economic empowerment, and better health outcomes. Today, we will discuss the impacts of the digital divide and other barriers to technological access. However, we will also discuss Black technological enthusiasm and agency, and the creative ways that Black users remix existing technologies to express themselves and build community. So to lead off that discussion, we're excited to welcome two distinguished scholars, Dr. Charlton McIlwain and Dr. André Brock. Charlton McIlwain is Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Engagement and a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. Dr. André Brock is an associate professor of media studies in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. And again, we're going to have Charlton present first. So at this point, I'll invite André to mute his audio and video, and then I will read Charlton's full bio while Emma pulls up his slides. Okay. So Charlton McIlwain is Vice Provost for Faculty Development Engagement at New York University and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU Steinhardt. He is the author of Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice from the AfroNet to Black Lives Matter, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. His work focuses on the intersections of computing technology, race, inequality, and racial justice activism. Dr. McIlwain has served as an expert witness in landmark US federal court cases on reverse redlining and racial targeting in mortgage lending, and has testified before the US House Committee on Financial Services about the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence on the financial services sector. He writes regularly for outlets such as The Guardian, Slate's Future Tense, and the MIT Technology Review about the intersections of race and technology. And we're delighted that he's here with us. So Charlton, take it away.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Eric, and thank you for your opening words, which I think in a very, very good way sort of set up both the conversation that the three of us will have, but certainly my remarks. I was very excited to hear you talk about the moment in 1996, which I'd love to talk more about, and there's some conversation in the slides here that point directly to that. But to get to the question for the day, which is, as you framed it, how Black individuals and communities experience technology, and I do want to trouble that a bit in terms of our formulation, because what I want to do today is to answer, or at least address or think through, excuse me, talk through that question through the lens of Black folks who were innovators, inventors within this context of thinking about the internet in particular. And I want to trouble then a little bit in terms of that relationship between users and the usual suspects we think of when we think about invention and innovation and where that comes from. So I'm delighted to be here to talk a little bit about that. I know I promised you I would probably not talk very long and get into our discussion, and look forward to talking to my friend André about something that we both love and enjoy talking about. But one thing struck me as I was putting together these slides, which is, as I wrote Black Software, and people who work with archival material know this well, or have written sort of real narrative-driven kind of works, that I'm putting together these slides and going back through imagery and so forth that you will see that invite me to sort of think and stop and think through again the particular image, the artifact, and the story that it tells. And those stories are profound, and it is why when I wrote Black Software, similar to what I hope to do over the next few minutes, was making a very real choice, and that was to resist doing what we do as scholars, which is to analyze, to explain things. So to resist doing that and to simply tell a story. And what was most powerful for me in writing Black Software and coming face to face with this question about how Black people have experienced technology, particularly in this framework of invention and innovation, what struck me most is and were the stories of real people, real Black folks who are not in most of our histories in any shape or form. And so that's what I want to walk through today, to take a little bit of a kind of walk through history, as it were, to talk about this question of Black people who have experienced technology, and then to talk about what that experience has transformed into in terms of our present day. So if we can go to the next slide, Emma, please. So this story begins for me with this. So imagine coming across this statement, which I found early on in doing the research for this book. It was in a edited volume, a big fat edited volume, written by Black folks primarily, an edited collection about invention. And here's the quote: "Public accessible archives and the current body of literature on the technical development of the internet do not reflect any significant contribution by African-American researchers or scientists. It remains unclear whether there no significant contribution has indeed been made, whether such contributions have not been documented, or whether such documentation has yet to be discovered or publicly shared." Imagine coming across that quote as I did. Imagine thinking through what this reflects. And there's a number of things that reflects, but for one, it reflects the invisibility of Black people in our histories of technology, generally our history of the internet in particular. And so it's that invisibility that we're trying to really push back against, even as we talk about our present moment connected to a historical past that is longer than we think when we think about Black people's engagement with technology. And primarily, as you were mentioning earlier, Eric, primarily in a framework where Black people have agency, right? There's a lot of room to, and most of what I end up talking about is some of the things you mentioned in terms of the devastating impacts that technology have had on Black folks for a long time and throughout century and decade. But this is a moment, I think, to talk about Black agency, Black centrality in technology from the standpoint of both users that are innovators, that are people who have invented things that are valuable in terms of technology, in terms of the internet. And a lot of this comes from taking a look at this 5.2 million. What does that represent? For me, it represents a devastating impact of a concept, the concept that we know as the digital divide, that despite its origins, despite the goodwill and what that term, that concept was supposed to help us do in spotlighting folks who did and did not have access to digital technology in the early and mid 90s, and who would be left behind as a result, the consequence of thinking about Black folks only in terms of what they did not have access to is in part this invisibility that fuels someone's ability to make the kind of statement that's on the board here. So 5.2 million people. This represents the number of Black people in 1995 who had access to a computer at home and were online, which means they had access to the hardware, the software, the modem capability, all of those things. So these are 5.2 million Black folks. Was it fewer than the white folks that were online at that time? Absolutely, in devastating proportions. But the question is, who are these 5.2 million people, and why is it that we know nothing, or at least very little about them, what they did, what they were doing, what fueled their engagement with the technology at the time? This is the story that we have very little that is reflected in our history, and certainly in terms of our larger experience around technology. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes, and I'm going to try to go through it quickly. I could talk about it certainly for a long time. So if we can go to the next slide. Just a little bit of walk down a key or a few stories here when we talk about how have African Americans engaged technology, and point out some of these key elements of engagements through folks like the one picture here, Kamal Al-Mansour. Kamal Al-Mansour was in the mid-late 80s at Jet Propulsion Labs. He had graduated with a law degree from Hastings College in San Francisco, went back to Southern California, ended up at JPL, associated, of course, with NASA. And his starting work was doing technology transfer work as an attorney. And so at a boom of new kind of technology enterprises, particularly around software development, he was at the forefront in thinking about intellectual property, the invention of software and other technological hardware, and how those might shift from the public to private sector and vice versa. And this was his work. And Kamal realized and had an epiphany of sorts one day as he relayed the story to me of saying, I'm looking around at JPL, I'm looking at what I'm doing, I'm looking at everyone who is talking about innovating, creating, profiting from this new thing called software, these new technological developments. What he did not see was anybody like him. He didn't see other Black folks engaged. He certainly didn't see himself at the center of all of these new technological developments that were growing up. And so Kamal expressed his engagement early on with that technology sphere as one of losing or threatening to lose his soul. And so that is what pushed him to a particular point to do what he knew, right? He started to think about, all right, if I'm at the margins, where can I find and what can I do to put Black people, Blackness at the center of this technological enterprise? And it's probably no surprise that being an attorney, being keen on things like intellectual property, that he decides to do something of his own and build what ultimately becomes AfroLink software. And the best part about this slide right here, I think someone's pointed out in the chat, is that trademark. I could sit here and talk about that and reflect on that all day. The picture that it represents, the angling, the positioning, but mostly the clear, unadulterated, unequivocal Blackness that is a part of and embedded in this instance of software and software building that ends up being part of what Kamal goes on to build over the next few years from the late 80s to the early 90s with AfroLink software, what becomes a multi-million-dollar business for him. And one, mind you, that I will say ended for him because of a very key moment and a very key realization that his development of AfroLink, his development of this commercial enterprise, he began, as he says, something that would potentially change the game, that would be disruptive. And ultimately, he found that it wasn't, given the technological context that ended up growing up in the mid 90s and the advent of the web as we know it. And so that venture then shut down, not because it wasn't commercially viable, but because it wasn't changing the scope of our software and technological development. It was not doing anything he saw significant to recenter Black people and Blackness at the center of this technology environment. Oops, sorry, I'm not doing my own slides. Emma, if you can take us to the next. So the experience of losing one's soul, not seeing oneself in the technology that's being built and utilized and circulating all around you. The other experience that we could talk about is the building of community. Here, what you have on the sheet, another just sort of image that I have spent a lot of time just thinking through, tracking down, that on the surface just looks like a bunch of phone numbers and code that if you're not familiar with the bulletin board systems of the late 70s and 80s and early 90s look foreign to you. But what is this? This is AfroNet. This is a group of users, Black computer users, Black computer networks that grew up in the mid to late 80s. I'll skip the sort of systemic aspects of how that technologically played out. But this was a community of folks who decided we want to build community in and with this new technological capability that we have been given. And so within this bulletin board framework, we are going to build systems and hubs that have very keen or particular nomenclature, right? They direct us. And it's interesting to me just to think about, number one, the list of and titles of the boards: Kinky Computers, Black Business, Nefertiti, You People, Online in the Hood, right? All of these things are a particular nomenclature, but it's a signal, and it's a signal of Blackness. It is, if you are looking across boards and places that you could get access to, this was one signal of something that was very true about this particular community, which is they wanted it to be Black. They wanted to connect to other Black computer users. They wanted to build community across geography in and across the United States and North America, but they were looking for a way to build and maintain connection amongst this particular group of people. And so they use this in some way to draw boundaries, but also to signal to people, hey, this is who belongs here. This is where you belong. And it operated on that kind of a system. If I knew and came across minority affairs, I had to go to that board's owner. I had to present my bona fides to be able to get access to the network. And then when that was granted, I was able to participate here. But the issue here is really, for me, about community. And as I reflect on a question, and I have no sort of direct longitudinal evidence that I've looked through sort of incessantly to build out this argument. But if I were going to say, what's the one thing that Black people have invented in terms of the internet, I would say it's this, and that is community. The ability to build community. And I understand that the 80s and the early internet gave us a number of online communities and ways of thinking about that, but building community, what that looks like, what it means, what comes out of it, the reasons to engage in it, is a particular, I think, invention and innovation of Black folk in this digital space. And part of that gets reflected in this next slide, which showed what folks wanted to do, understanding and seeing what the AfroNet had done, which is to bring together communities of Black folk. And so as you get to the transition point where we move away from other forms of network computing to the open web, the commercial web, those that are trying to market and profit are trying to find community, and they find that in AfroNet. And so CompuServe in particular, who goes to members of AfroNet to try to get them to do what they were doing through and on CompuServe. And it touched off a battle that ultimately led to nothing. And because in large part, it was a model that said, you have something we want and we see we can profit from. Can you build it and let us profit from it? And the members of the AfroNet said, no, if you're really interested in community and helping us and this community thrive, you'll just let us do our thing. We'll take your money, but we'll do our thing. And CompuServe didn't go with that model. Ultimately, we're not able to sustain this particular space. either as a continually thriving entity as it was in its instantiation for AfroNet, and certainly not as a commercial enterprise. If we go to the next slide, I know I got to wrap up soon. Two gentlemen here that represent, I think, a significant moment in what I often say in a comment about what was once a title in my book. Ultimately, I did away with it, but the concept remains, which is remember when the internet was Black. And that has everything to do with what I've talked about before, but also a realization about this particular moment and significance of David Ellington on the left, Malcolm Cassell on the right, who had the brilliance of a lawyer, an entertainment lawyer who knew Black people, Black culture, who knew that everybody, Black, white, or otherwise, loved, thrived on Black cultural production, and the computer geek, the Stanford computer scientist, another African-American guy that came together and said, we've got a new venture. We marry this new thing that they're calling the internet with what we know America loves and the world loves, which is Black culture. We put those two together and we have a recipe for success. They found a willing ear in the form of someone who was heading, at that time, a little known company called AOL. And thank you for the person who mentioned in the chat a particular bittersweet moment, which is that 2 nights ago, or it may have actually been last night, looking back at Facebook and looking at David Ellington's page where he had posted a note that his business partner, longtime business partner, Malcolm Cassell, had died in Mexico just a couple of nights ago. But these two folks built, and I'm not going to be able to give its due significance, but think about this. Think about the internet of 1995. That's very different from our internet today. The internet of 1995 that doesn't have something that we know powers the internet today, and that is users. At a time when people don't have a reason to be connected, that people have not in mass found the compelling reasons to buy a computer, to buy a modem, to buy a service like AOL, to invest all of this money to get online only to pay huge amounts of money and subscription fees and time being online. The internet, in order to be a thriving commercial space, needed users. It's what they did not have in mass in 94 and 95. Net Noir was the first primary entity. It was through AOL that was built that drove masses of people across the world, Black folks and otherwise, to this new medium, right? Remember when the internet was Black has everything to do with Net Noir and everything that came before it. The idea that Black people, Black life, Black experience, Black culture and cultural production was at the center of the web. And what we know, if we, of course, move to the next slide, is that all of this, in many ways, in many respects, disappears. That is, actually, let me stop here and go back. I'm getting ahead of myself, and I promise André and others I'm about to wrap up. No, we can go back to the next slide. But I want to bring in Anita Brown, who I think amongst all of these innovators that we are talking about is probably more significant in many ways than others. You can see in the middle the headline that was from Wired magazine, Meet Anita Brown, the best known Black woman on the web. It's a Black woman in 1995, 96, 97, didn't have a college degree, didn't have impressive credentials, wasn't building a business. She was a 53-year-old grandmother, Northeast Washington, DC. And she was rumored and known to have the largest email list of Black folks anywhere in the world. And she used it, to do something else that I think Black people innovate and do with technology, and that is to connect, right? So the early 90s was a moment when we recognized that Black folks could be openly not monolithic, to express our diversity, that we could have with the advent of this new medium, people who were wanting to get commercial and seize commercial success, who wanted to use this as a tool for economic empowerment. And we could have the folks who were the activists and wanted to use this to do good for the Black community. Anita Brown was the person to bridge all of these different communities of Black folks who were flocking to this new medium to do new and innovative things. Black Geeks Online, the site that she built, the digital rent parties that she threw, all the things that were legendary and innovative in 95 and 96 throughout the 90s, that of course continue, if we go to the next slide, my final slide, continues as the world recognizes the value of Black people and Black culture, I should say the value of Black culture to the internet, to the digital sphere, but have jettisoned, if we can go to the next slide, jettisoned Black people from the ability to really thrive and profit from that. And so our internet, as it continues from this point forward, takes Black culture, leaves Black people behind in many respects. Emma, if you can get the next slide for me, and I will wrap up. If we can't do that, I will, maybe we'll get it eventually. And I'm gonna end with a quote from Black Software from Derek Brown that I think in many ways sums up this question about Black people's engagement with technology. Derek Brown was an engineer at Clemson, moved on to get his master's in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech, and ended and said this quote. He talked about learning how to write code and said, when I'm writing code, all I'm trying to do is stitch together the algorithm to score a bowling game. That's cool, but it's not the same thing as writing. I'm a writer. That's my lane. I want to take these tools and make them beautiful and make them do beautiful things. If I can find some beauty, some application, I'm going to grab that, because that is what will compel other people to engage and use it. I'm going to stop there, taking way too much time. Apologies to André and Eric. Thank you.
Charlton, thank you so much. And sorry about the missing final slide there. That's our bad. I don't know what happened there, but thank you for that final quote by Derek Brown. I remember seeing the slide there. And so fantastic way to wrap up with the idea that users make things beautiful when they're building a community online. So thank you for your final, for your great presentation. Really appreciate it. So as a reminder to the audience, you can start putting your questions for Charlton and André into the Q&A feature right away, when I've already seen a couple. And we'll make sure to go through those after André's talk. And now we will pivot. Looks like André's already got his video up, good. And then I'll invite you to put your slides up while I read your full biography. All right. So Dr. André Brock is an associate professor of media studies in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. He writes on Western technoculture, Black technoculture, and digital media. His scholarship examines Black and white representations in social media, video games, weblogs, and other digital media. Dr. Brock has published influential research on digital research methods, and his first book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, was published by New York University Press in 2020, just this year. Congratulations. That book theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by networked technologies, and we're just delighted that he's here with us. So André, Dr. Dre, take it away.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Lemelson Center for inviting me to be in conversation with one of my favorite interlocutors, Dr. McIlwain, on the subject of Black inventors and innovators. This brief talk, this Baptist Church brief talk, is drawn from my book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, which as Eric mentioned is out now. And for those of you who are interested, I'll drop a link to the open access version in the chat. The cover art was done by the amazing artist Paul Davey, who can be found on DeviantArt, for those of you who remember that site, under the name Matahan. Distributed Blackness is drawn from my empirical research over the last decade into the peculiar phenomenon of Black folk being Black online, minding their own Black-ass business, and the ways in which American culture interacts with and understands that Blackness, their agency, and their digital expertise. Today, I'd like to introduce you to the methodological and theoretical insights I've gleaned while studying the digital and Black digital cultures. The central claim of my book that Charlton dragged me for during manuscript review is that Black folk have a natural affinity for the internet and digital media. My claim is pragmatic, that Black expressivity is rightfully lauded in literature, in the arts, and in reaction gifs. It's gifs, not gifs. But Black linguistic expression is considered uncultured and uneducated in technical and professional society. But Black digital practice puts paid to this line of thinking through its inventive, energetic discourses in online spaces. My claim is also ecological, that Black folk have made the internet a Black space, whose contours have become visible through sociality and distributed digital practice, like the hashtag, while decentering whiteness as a default internet identity. Moreover, I argue that Black folks' natural internet affinity is as much about how Black folk understand and employ technology and the digital as it is about how Blackness is constituted within the material and virtual world of the internet itself. I name these Black digital practices, their online spaces, racial enactments and performances, and cultural online phenomena as Black cyberculture. A primary intention for this book was to step away from Western technocultural norms of digital practice, that being modern and online must always be productive and efficient. These norms are held by mainstream society, but curiously also by the conservative elements of Black culture, where respectability proponents want their children and cousins in them to act better. So Distributed Blackness examines the Black mundane in the digital. One example of the expressivity and invention in online Blackness can be found in the hashtag phrase Black Girl Magic. I see these qualities listed on this slide as aspects of the Black post-present, or our navigation of modernity while looking towards the future. So Twitter power user and creator of the hashtag, Kashawn Thompson, describes Black Girl Magic as being about Black girls that do hair in their kitchen, disabled Black girls, lesbian Black girls, fat Black girls, poor Black girls, Black girls with relaxers and weaves, Black girls that are single moms, Black girls that haven't figured out how to blend their makeup, incarcerated Black girls, trans Black girls, teenage Black girls, uneducated and undereducated Black girls that work low-paying jobs, and Black girls that present as masculine, and the list could go on forever. I see these articulations of an embodied Blackness encapsulated by the hashtag as illustrating an Afro-future, where the Black mundane and our capacity to invent something out of nothing becomes inscribed in the digital for a distributed, communitarian, virtual Black cultural space. So I approach the digital from a critical perspective, but who isn't critical these days? I understand that the guiding questions that many of us seek to answer are, what is this thing, this platform, this medium, this system that is being discussed or studied? What is the use's potential as stated by the creators? How are these things being used? And what are the differences between your answers for the previous questions? For me, one of the most important things is, who is the audience for this thing? And what is the impact? And these are the hallmarks of a critical analysis of technology, one that begins from an analysis of the conceptual problematics of information and communication technology use, design, and dissemination. Ronald Day notes that conceptual problematics can only be resolved, possibly, rather than solved, because cultural materials such as information are not causal. As an example, racism is a conceptual problematic rather than a problem to be solved. There is no technical fix that will eliminate racism from technology industries or social media conversations. Instead, by examining the affordances of interfaces and the meaning-making strategies of the digital practices, alongside discourses mediated by them, we can begin to understand how to address both the potential of Black digital practice and, if we're interested, the problematics of uncivil discourses. In my courses at Georgia Tech, I encourage my students to question their established sociocultural assumptions and values of information, of the digital, and of technology, particularly as they play themselves out and as they are institutionalized in the university, in their training, and in the rivers or lakes that you're used to, or your own cultural assumptions. No one is able to escape bringing their experiences, values, and training into technology design. Silicon Valley's insistence that tech will always be innovative or disruptive is a fine example. So my research inquiry recognizes this by conceptualizing technology from a three-part perspective. Arnold Pacey, one of my canonical influences, conceives of technology in three parts: technical, organizational, and cultural, or in my work, as artifact, practice, and the belief. In the academy, we tend to conduct normative, either this is true or and good, or true and bad, or analytic, just the facts, ma'am, approaches to technology research. But these approaches are instrumentalist, by which I mean that technology is seen as extrinsic to a person's being and to a society's character. As a result, a fair amount of the research that the academy produces is concerned with what people do rather than why people do digital practice. Both Pacey and I argue from a critical perspective that culture is the least examined aspect of any technology artifact or practice, because we only focus on what the technology is and how it works. In the meantime, culture and belief work behind the scenes to situate ourselves within our uses of the technology. This becomes hugely important when examining beliefs about Black folk and technology, because across this modern era, we have been understood as objects, never subjects. Even when Black folk do pick up technologies, we are often seen from a deficit perspective: least educated, least wealthy, least moral, and these beliefs get written into technology design and practice. So to operationalize the beliefs powering technoculture, I turn to libidinal economy, which is probably the most complicated way I could have done this. As defined by Francois Lyotard, libidinal economy describes the emotional impulses and desires powering the machinations of political economy. He uses the term jouissance to describe our enjoyment of use, of the seeking of pleasure and desires, of play, and of climax. But jouissance, which was translated poorly in the edition that I had as bliss or desire, right, is not restricted to joy, to pleasure, or even celebration, although it contains those things. In my work, I argue for jouissance as both ritual catharsis and an excess of life. In the process, I believe that information technology has its own libidinal economy, which can be understood as techno-rationalist and demotic. And here I'm stealing from Graham Turner, who argues that our information technologies are argued for as democratic, but they only give the appearance of democracy because they are constantly regulated by the tech companies, by the moderators that they employ, by laws that implement principles of free speech or privacy, but also by our own social institutions, right? And so demotic more clearly explains the appearance of democracy that we see in online spaces. And this information economy of this libidinal economy of information technology also incorporates mass media's desires for representation, availability, and access. Libidinal economy, and one of the reasons why I stepped to it, was because I encountered Frank Wilderson's Red, White, and Black. And he argues in that book that libidinal economy is linked not only to forms of attraction, affection, and alliance, but also to aggression, destruction, and the violence of lethal consumption. From this perspective, I'd like to ask you to consider W.E.B. Du Bois' signal formulation of double consciousness as an expression of the libidinal tensions between Black communitarian identity and white categorial subjugation, domination, and personhood. The reason I needed to operationalize belief is because I'm a discourse analyst, and I take a critical discourse analytic approach to understanding technologies. And I call it critical technocultural discourse analysis, which is guaranteed to make me stumble over the acronym at least once. This technique combines analysis of the meaning making of interfaces alongside an analysis of the articulations of information technology users using those technologies. As a digressive example, when I first started doing this work, one of the things I noted when I was studying online forums such as Net Noir, Everything Black, and the emergence of Black blogs was that in many cases, Black folk understanding that the digital elided their identity would jump into discussions in more mainstream sites by saying, I am Black and. Right? So they spoke themselves into existence in this digital space by using their cultural identity as a warrant for the knowledge that they were about to drop on people. And I find this still to be true even in our social media environment. CTDA offers the opportunity to think about technology, artifacts, practices, and discourses in parallel, using a conceptual framework, interrogating power relations to tease out the connections between them. This approach provides a holistic analysis of the interactions between technology, cultural ideology, and technology practice, and it is most useful to researchers familiar with qualitative discourse or quantitative content analysis. If you have observed some specific digital phenomena or practice and have gathered some preliminary data, a corpus, you will find it quite powerful, even though it's compelling and unwieldy. And let me tell you how powerful it can be. So let me walk you quickly through an example of an analysis I conducted in distributed Blackness using CTDA. On January 5th, 2017, Yahoo Business published a bad tweet. This tweet ostensibly references the Trump administration's desire to ramp up military presence for naval dominance over China in the South China Sea. And there are a number of possible reactions as analysts to this. A normative, instrumental reading of this text would say this tweet was a technical publication error. You know, that damned autocorrect. Although I have never seen an autocorrect that would change bigger to nigger, but that's just me, right? A negotiated analytical reading could acknowledge that nigger was a typo, that the typist didn't feel in their heart, in the process noting that it could be read as offensive, you know, racialized discourse. An oppositional reading, right? Either the Black radical presence on Twitter or conservative freakouts over cancel culture would reject this text altogether, seeing it as either explicit evidence of the bigotry of the Trump administration or of the mainstream media, which allowed the tweet to be published in the first place. The CTDA analysis, however, encourages us to consider how the Black community, arguably the one most injured by this tweet, would consider this affront. The results will surprise you. 20 minutes after the Yahoo tweet was posted, the Twitter Special Archives Unit, SVU, posted a screenshot, and a new hashtag followed shortly thereafter. This hashtag, Nigger Navy, can be viewed here as evoking Black joy to ostensibly discuss naval warfare, institutions, and practices, but actually to darkly critique labor capitalism, social protocols and etiquette, Black parenting strategies, and much more. As you can see, these shenanigans are enacted through Black cultural discourse, digital practice, and recollections of lived experiences. Although not depicted here, other tweets contextualize the hashtags with photos of Black celebrities and Black media culture, all mediated by the call and response functions of Black Twitter hashtag practice. So from a CTDA analysis, Black Twitter can enact joy, not a naive happiness, but a celebration of life, and the practice of articulating a joyful response to inadvertent racism, an empathetic yet critical take on Black culture, signifying on something that originally had little to do with Black culture. And most importantly for this presentation, while it could be read as resistance to social death, Black joy instead offers a cathartic response enabled through invention and digital media's affordances of media, display, and distribution, plus social media's affordances for sharing, right? So Nigger Navy as a moment of Black digital practice is a reflective moment about the complexity and joys of Black culture in dialogue with the machinic, nebulously distributed generation of racist ideology, or weak tie racism. Black Twitter and Nigger Navy practitioners avoid being made invisible by the white racial frame, doing so using humor and empathy. And this reflexivity is mediated through digital practice, giving voice to a response drawing from a communal, embodied epistemology that differs dramatically from techno-cultural norms of opaque rationality and discourse. Right. So let me close this out really quickly because I know we're getting close, right? So what I ended up doing at the end of Distributed Blackness is coming up with what I call a matrix of Black technoculture, which I have on the screen. And they are Blackness, intersectionality, invention and style, America, modernity, and the future. But in the interest of time, I'll only discuss one. For Black technoculture, the libidinal tension of modernity is precisely the informational, capitalistic, and institutional regime of anti-Blackness. Surveillance and sousveillance, digital redlining, access to education, and even voting rights are all positioned in ways that limit, if not directly injure, Black folk on the way to reifying whiteness. Unfortunately, for Blackness, there is no escaping modernity. There is no Afrofuturist utopia, as it is the defining frame of Western society, and its transformative effects have reshaped much of the world in the West's image. In the Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy also inveighs against utopian concessions of Blackness and modernity, arguing instead that Blackness should be understood as a counterculture for modernity. For Gilroy, the inescapability of slavery as foundational to the West's conception of self calls the entire project of modernity into question. That is, Black progress from slaves to citizens reproduces the unity of ethics and politics as folk knowledge. I love that sentence. This position refutes modernity's insistence that ontology, axiology, and aesthetics belong to distinct knowledge domains, a position privileging whiteness' Cartesian and Christian insistence on the separation of mind and body. For example, when modernity and capitalism insist that work is emancipatory and provides agency, Black folk have long understood that work only signifies servitude, misery, and subordination. Gilroy argues that Black maternity should be understood then as a vernacular variety of unhappy consciousness. But in my developing Afro-optimistic perspective, however, Black modernity deserves more than unhappiness. Double consciousness, which Charlton and I both admire, can be framed through libidinal economy as a tension between jouissance and plaisir, or pleasure. It's not as simple as saying that submitting to the hegemony of white racial ideology is plaisir. Moreover, the experience of Blackness is not exempt from hegemony. How could it be? And can be interpolated through plaisir. And I argue that because I see respectability politics, which overdetermines Black technical identity in many cases, right, as trying to enframe a specific kind of Black identity as hegemonically comfortable for the economic and social gain of a Black middle class. This aspirational discourse is technologized through modernist strategies of aesthetic, linguistic, and even physical hygiene. The communal identity that Du Bois refers to in his epigraph, itself beholden to uplift politics and respectability, should more properly be articulated as a communal yet heterogeneous Black identity. This heterogeneity, collaborative and multiplicitous, can be understood as an irreducible sociality of Black life. In other words, double consciousness describes the tensions involved in the pleasure of being Black and despair or the position of being Black in American culture, right? An epistemological position allowing for hope despite the pathological assignation of social death in the Western polity. So distributed Blackness doesn't have a conclusion. It ends with this provocation that Blackness needs this formulation of its own formulation of technoculture. Right? And as I've said throughout this presentation, or as I've alluded to throughout this presentation, racism cannot be the sole defining characteristic of Black identity, and Black technoculture can't be limited to middle-class aspirations. Instead, Black technoculture is necessary for us because the digital affords Blackness space within which it can luxuriate and grow, enclaved from, but never free from white racial ideology. And this possibility exists because of the disembodiment enabled by virtuality or simulation. That is, even while we sit at a laptop or hold a phone, we're still participating both in our bodies and in an online space. So the embodied cognition of Blackness lives as an existential here, largely unrestricted by the fixity and pejorative reduction of the Black body that occurs offline. Online, I am not only a point of view, but I'm also a point that is viewed. Thanks.
André, I hope you look at the chat because everyone's minds are blown right now. That was just a powerful, just powerful in terms of method, and then how you've used the method to bring to light new facts, new observations about Black technoculture. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that powerful presentation. And also just a brief apology to Charlton McIlwain, as seems inevitable in like Zoom land. We had a little hiccup in copying over your slides, but we tracked it down. And so I just wanted to invite Emma to share that slide. And if you wanted, invite you to read that final quote from Derek Brown again, if you'd like.
Sure, I'll take the opportunity after being blown away by the last few minutes. But it underscores it. I'm going to use this to this is my, in some ways, coming out to André about what he mentioned about his book, and me dragging him on a concept about the inherent capability of Black folks in digital culture, which is the discussion we've often had has been around this notion of presenting Black digital life as always already politically engaged, necessarily politically engaged in some way, and disregarding in some way what Derek has presented here, which is the thing when I think historically about Black digital culture. When I am writing code, and Derek was talking about his sort of juxtaposition of being an engineer and having to learn code, but thinking more about what gives him pleasure and joy as a writer. And so when I'm writing code, all I'm trying to do is stitch together the algorithm to score a bowling game. That's cool, but it's not the same thing as writing. I'm a writer. That's my lane. I want to take these tools and make them beautiful and make them do beautiful things. If I can find some beauty, some application, I'm going to grab that, because that is what will compel other people to engage and use it. Thanks for letting me share that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma, for tracking that down. So just to sort of orient us where we are, it's about 2 o'clock. We got half an hour. And just again, thanks to both presenters, both Charlton and André. I'll just make another reminder and encouragement to the audience to go ahead and submit your questions for both speakers to the panel using Zoom's Q&A function. And while those roll in, the three of us are just going to engage in a few minutes of dialogue. And I know you guys have known each other for a long time, so I have this feeling you guys are just going to go off. So I better get one really good question in, right? Because you guys just may take off, right? So forgive me. I'm gonna take my prerogative and ask one question, and it has to do with this kind of interesting tension or dialectic when it comes to sort of access. You mentioned words like centrality, the epistemological standpoint, and so on one hand, Charlton put up the slide, talked about the digital divide. And yet there's the 5.2 million. We know that socioeconomic factors and deliberate exclusions have hindered the Black community's access to technology. That seems to be a fact. And yet on the other hand, you guys trouble that entirely, right? By taking the Black epistemological standpoint, by centering Blackness. And so I would just invite you guys to play with that. I mean, can both of those things be true at the same time? Is there both a digital divide and the centrality of Blackness in digital technoculture?
There is both happen simultaneously. And so I think the violence is our sort of natural, I guess, tendency to magnify one element of that, which is what Black folks don't have or have access to, and then to make assumptions about why that's the case, or what is not possible within this particular group of people. And that was the violence that was done with the concept early on. Nobody asked the question, all right, we know that a lot of folks don't have access to the technology, but what are these people doing around me, right? When I look around the space, and in 94, 95, you found people. The internet wasn't that big. We were there, people saw us, but to sort of disregard and say, no, the only way that we are going to interrogate Blackness and Black life is from this deficit perspective, as folk who do not have agency and engagement with this technological tool. That's what has done the disservice and the erasure, and made it such that we cannot recognize not just the contributions, the centrality, right? The centrality, as André mentioned, with that element of culture, right? We come at this and say, the internet and invention is really all about who invented the technical hardware and the software and so forth, but we know culture powers the internet, right? And that culture is centered in Black cultural experience and production, and that's what has been erased for all these many years.
What he said. The only thing I'll add is that I came into this field through digital divide research, right? And I was immediately frustrated because it didn't speak to my history or my embodiment, right? As a technological agent. Like I had a Commodore 64 back in the 80s, right? So I grew up in New York, where I was watching drug dealers carry two-way pagers. And in fact, one of my favorite songs is Tribe Called Quest, Do You Know the Importance of a Sky Pager, right? So we've always been technological subjects, and the framing of the digital divide really relied upon the interpretation of statistics about Black environmental conditions, right? But instead of interpreting them as conditions which they were subjected to because of discriminatory policies of the US government, educational systems, lack of access to employment, lack of access to, being situated in environmental pollution, right? They just said Black people, they went with the culture of poverty thing. Black people just are not capable of these things, right? And that has always been a problem to me. That being said, there are some people who are really struggling to acquire what has become the incredibly expensive practice of being online. Like, we take it for granted that kids should have cell phones and laptops and perhaps tablets, right? But the minimum wage is the same as it has been for the last, I think, 15 or 20 years. It's $7.25 here in Georgia. But my internet bill is $100. My phone bill is $200. An iPad costs $500. A laptop costs $1,000, right? So when you talk about a digital divide, it's much more, it's just as important to talk about the conditions that foster that digital divide, as opposed to saying it's Black folks are the reason why they're behind, right? So it's both, like Charlton says, it's both and.
Cool.
And I think it's interesting to see how we've ended up in many ways with a wider gap now, after 20 plus years of thinking and talking about a digital divide, largely because of that sort of directionality, where we talk about who is responsible, what is responsible, and that's been allowed to fester. And we find ourselves in a situation now with these things that André mentioned, and that come into full focus in a moment like now, where we're in crisis, and that access is necessary, not just a tool for pleasure or what we could do for varying types of entertainment or other kinds of productive practice. But when this laptop becomes school for me, or the access to education or not, And I look at all of these, factors around cost, around broadband access or good broadband access, and all those kinds of things that get magnified. So it's all a twisted mess.
Like Xfinity tried to make a public relations coup out of the fact that when lockdown happened back in March, they made all their hotspots available free of access to anybody. You didn't have to have a login, right? But what that neglects is that if Xfinity was already under federal mandate to provide last mile broadband access, right? So you're not doing nothing that you hadn't already gotten subsidies and payments from the federal government for, right? So just, it's the same thing as a billionaire philanthropy. That's nice, right? But pay your taxes. We could have the spaces that we need to exist in now our remote society, right? That we should have had all along.
Yeah, no, as Shantavia Johnson said yesterday, innovation is expensive, but sometimes being a technology user can be expensive too, and it's not easy. So that's a good reminder. I almost hesitate to ask this question because you've decentered this notion of, but I'm going to go plow through anyway. You've decentered this notion of, Black technology users as this deficit model, technology used on Black bodies and things like that. And yet there is this long troubled history. You guys have told mostly recent histories. If you go back a little further in Charlton's book, and you guys have focused kind of on how community building happens, but there is this nefarious side of technology being used for incarceration, for surveillance, and for other harms against the Black community. And I know in Charlton's book, he talks about the committeemen, how there were deliberate exclusions, and how, computing systems have been used for things like predictive policing and other kinds of systems that have been harmful to the Black community. So I guess I just wanted to ask, is there a fundamental mistrust from your point of view of technology among Black people, even amidst all of the ways that you've described how they use them with joy and jouissance?
I don't know if I would, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, please.
Nah, I'll pass.
I should guide you guys better, sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Charlton, because I'm not sure exactly how to formulate what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I don't know if I would characterize it as an explicit mistrust, but perhaps. But I think it's in some ways larger than that. I think it's a sense in which many Black folks know and realize and see through the history of technology, even longer than the last 20 years, longer than the last 50 years. Simone Brown writes about a longer history about technology and the nefarious ways it gets used against Black people to police Black movement and Black bodies. So I think there's a sense in which we know things were not made for us, in a sense, right? We know that there was a sense, and the reason I like part of the book that I wrote is because it's written and it reflects a time where, people made no bones about that. Today, you'll get, all kinds of obfuscations of course, we make everything to be equitable and transparent and to really help all people regardless of X, Y, and Z. But 1960s, they were like, look, we got Black folks running around the streets causing trouble, messing things up. We need something that can keep them in line, keep them in place. And we got this new technological power to do that. So this is what we need to focus this new technology on. So that's explicit. And I think there's a sense in which the other night we were together, I read this quote from Roy Wilkins, and I think he said it well. And it was talking about a prior technological revolution in terms of farming and the advent of the cotton gin and those technologies, and looking forward to what was happening in the computing revolution at the time, is the late 1960s. And he was talking about Negro farmers, and particularly those that got too uppity because they got too rich and prosperous and had to hide themselves so they wouldn't get close to approximating whiteness or have the audacity to think they had the ability to push back against whiteness. And what he says was, it was never meant for these farmers to be prosperous, to utilize this technology to advance themselves and their position. And he made that analogy about the seeding and the burgeoning computing industry in late 1960s. And I think that's what we see reflected in this kind of sense of mistrust today. It is that if we are going to do something with this, it's going to be because we do it and make it and take it and grab it, not because it was built in its first instance to help us flourish.
So Distributed Blackness was intentionally written from an Afro-optimist perspective, right? Because there are plenty of books talking about how bad systems are. But even still, I have to recognize that racism, right? And I talk about it as modernity, right? Is a system that we are subjugated by, that is the founding engine for the economy and the technologies of our modern era, right? And so I go back to this lovely book by Caitlin Reynolds, where she talks, her title is Accounting for Slavery. And she talks about how slavery plantations were actually the first instantiation of modern society, because in many ways, the overseers and the plantation owners used quantifiable accounting techniques to determine how quickly a slave could basically clear a row of cotton or clear a row of cane, right? So they instituted managerial practices that we now understand and that we can see in Amazon's warehouses, right? Where the machines dictate how fast a worker can pick products. It's always so ironic to me, right? Right. And these machines, like the overseers who were not the owners, but the managers, these machines can fire workers, right? If they don't meet those quotas or conduct themselves in ways that will enhance Amazon's profits. So modernity is all about the abstraction of humanity in order to further capitalistic and often imperialistic gains. From that perspective, Ramon Amaro, who I love his work, talks about the Black technical object, right? And so when you are consistently built into systems as the thing to be worked on or the thing to be worked of, right? As opposed to an agent. So we could talk about redlining, right? And how ostensibly redlining doesn't exist, yet real estate agents will still steer prospective owners, Black owners, to properties that are either worth less or charge them much more, right? And so these institutions are built to provide differential access to people who look like me. And that makes us suspicious. Like, we are well aware that as a Black woman entering childbirth, that we have to really be on our toes to tell the doctors what it is that's going on with our bodies, because these doctors have been trained to believe that Black people don't experience pain and that we don't know anything, right? And so, you know, it becomes a matter of life or death. Somebody in a panel I was just in brought up Henrietta Lacks, right? In which her people never profited from the billions of dollars that have been, you know, these monoclonal antibodies that they just came out with. Some of that is based on the HeLa cells, right? It's really fascinating to think about how Blackness is at once an object of technological expertise and yet subjected to these excesses. So yeah, Black people are definitely cynical, but we also have to use these systems to survive. Charlton may remember this, like, you've been in New York for a minute. There used to be this thing called payphones. And as a New Yorker in the 80s, before call waiting really got instituted, there was a culture of people waiting to use payphones in that one location in the neighborhood, right? Every house didn't have it, right? So if you needed privacy, because everybody didn't have one in their room, no, everybody didn't have a cell phone, you would go to the payphone. If you had to wait, you had to wait. And if you need to bum a dime, you'd bum a dime or a Lucy, right? Or something. And so we have constantly been able to adjust ourselves to the inequities levied against us, right? And I see that as an invention, right? But at the same time, it comes with this suspicion, like, we're still mad because there aren't payphones in the neighborhood anymore, right? Because, you know, the deregulation of the telecom industry meant that AT&T was forced to pull out, and we got hit with these fly-by-night telephone operators who charge us much more for the same call, right? Over and over again, it seems these systems seem to continually find ways to put heap inequities on the Black technical object. And so,
yeah. And I was, as you mentioned, Henrietta Lacks, I was just thinking as we wait and hope for a vaccine, thinking about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, just more and more and more of these kinds of stories. So yes, but I like your optimism. So don't ever lose that.
Well,
go ahead, Charlton. Yep.
Quickly, I wanted to ask André a question about this optimism, or reflecting really about the origins of the internet and those practices. And was that an exception? You see that as an exception, meaning this wasn't a response to or a kind of a survival move to have folks who were grabbing up computers and networking and creating and exchanging games and all kinds of stuff like that in the late 80s and early 90s. Does the internet as a technology present a cultural space, a Black cultural productive space that you would say was free from kind of coercion, as it were, meaning this wasn't a direct result of having to figure out how to survive or thrive in a given space? It was a place of, I don't know, free, at least for a moment, to see a space of maybe freedom or.
So I really loved Shantavia's presentation the other day about the expense of being an inventor. What the internet did with the advent of the personal computer and then later the introduction of network capacity to those computers is allowed young Black folk to bypass the structures that would have gate kept them from being in those spaces. And it's not just the computer, right? I think about James, is it James Lawson, the brother who just passed, who invented Jerry Lawson, who invented the video game cartridge, right? There are many of those folk who were inventing despite the structures that were levied against them. The one Black engineer at IBM or Bell Labs or right? There were still other people who were tinkering in their garages, their basements, in the backyards, right? And so the computer allowed us to bring that into the bedroom. And my canonical example of Black invention in the absence of gatekeeping is Black Planet, right? MySpace to a lesser extent, but Black Planet in particular, because I know so many people who have bragged about being 13 years old and being paid $10,000 a month for building personal homepages for people on Black Planet, right? Yeah. So Omar Wasow and Gary Dauphin and them really deserve their props because they built out a space against the advice of VCs. And they argued that Black folk, if presented with the opportunity, would do their own coding. And yes, we did. Right now, these pages were very much like the Angel Fire and GeoCities pages. They were gaudy and loud. They had auto playing music that we hated and pictures of Black women with roses and wine glasses. You know what I'm saying? But that was the aesthetics of the time, right? But these kids learned how to do HTML and CSS coding, and many of them went on to have careers in the industry, right? Same thing with blogs. Many of the folk that we see now who are respected journalists like Jamel Bowie and Ta-Nehisi Coates and so many others, right, were bloggers when that first hit. And so that the internet has allowed a wider subsection of Black people to prosper in a technological environment that they ordinarily wouldn't have had access to, right? It's very much different in that regard than the telephone and radio, right? Which radio is infinitely powerful to me because I grew up on Black talk radio stations, right? I can't remember what's his name. Was it Leonard Jeffries in New York City that had his own talk show, right? But they're all of them all over the country where they had either cable access shows or talk radio shows where you could learn about your community from a perspective that was different than was offered by the mainstream. Similarly with the telephone, right? It allowed us to have access to networks of labor that we normally wouldn't have had to have, to the point where the telephone became a necessity, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. I think I kind of did.
Exactly.
I want to, Eric, I want to kind of answer a couple of questions from the chat. So,
sure. Yeah, I was just going to pivot to that. Perfect. Go for it.
Yep. Amy Slayton, who had a marvelous presentation earlier this week, asked, is the recovery, let me see if I read it right, racism as a problematic, what it does to the project of historical recovery that we see recountings of lost Black inventors. And that's always an interesting question to me coming from library science, because I'm aware that in many cases, Black folk are not to be found in the archive, right? Jessica Marie Johnson talks about this in her book, Wicked Flesh, right? In many cases, you cannot get genealogical records of Black folk, much less poetry or the like. Like, you have to depend on either one, the person having the leisure to craft these letters and documents, and then their preservation, and somebody's presence of mind to then donate them to an archive. So you get them very scattered, right? And so in a certain way, it's a conundrum, because it represents both a subsection of Black existence, Black identity, those with the leisure and time and energy to produce those things, but it also brings forth aspects that would never have been seen otherwise, right? So one of the things I love about talking about the internet is the internet, properly understood, should be seen as an archive, right? Even though it's a rapidly decaying archive, and much of the stuff gets buried under the weight of the stuff that's being uploaded, right? And yet and still, there are so many spaces where Black folk teach one another about the things that are important to us. So one of the things I've been trying to do for the last decade is Black natural hair bloggers on YouTube, right? Because there's these huge communities of women who not only do Black hairstyles, so they transmit aesthetic norms and invention, right? But there are also Black women who are chemists analyzing the formulas of Shea Moisture and Pantene and posting those results to talk about porosity and hair grays and stuff. Like, where else would you find that? And that's archived for as long as YouTube exists, right? On YouTube, and entire communities have been built around them, right? So historical recovery should properly be extended to the wealth of information that has been published that is often not preserved, right, on the internet, right? And so I see it as an important thing. Charlton, you want to take a question?
No, well, I'm just going to piggyback a little bit on you to add on another space, which is Usenet news groups, which to a certain degree Google has picked up and preserved. And so, I mean, taking that walk back through late 80s, really, that you can get reflected there, just so much that is part of that historical Black expression, right? That comes out that you cannot find in an archive, that you can't find, people who have access to an institution or who would be readily thinking, all this stuff I've collected on the, the printer paper with the perforations that I got to tear off. And that should go somewhere, and I can remember the last 2 or 3 years, countless people talking about, yeah, that stuff was in a box, and then I got divorced, and, my wife took the house, and I was too mad and said, fuck it with the box, and threw it away, not really thinking there is value, and all the stuff that does not now kind of come through that you see that is kind of foreclosed. But there's a lot there that we have not even bothered to look for that is accessible to us to preserve, that I think, to Andre's point, that is bears responsibility for us to do.
There's the danger of social media as our archive as well, because it encourages this individualized archive that when you download your work, it does not include the connections that you made to others, right? Your pictures, your photos, your posts, it's stripped of all context, right? And the way social networks operate, you can't download those connections that you made, right? And so because social media is eating up blogs, it's trying to eat up Twitter, which is now like Instagram, which is now like Snapchat, which is now like Facebook, right? Because they've tried to become the same product, but at the same time, deprecate the amount of things that belong to us and we can archive for our own historical identity and perspective, right? We're really in a dangerous moment. And I hope that we can figure out ways. I love Burgess Jewell's work with documenting the now, right? And they're working on building out what a Black web archive is. Is it content authored by Black people? Is it content authored for Black people, right? Mm-hmm. Like Africana.com was sponsored by Microsoft and the Washington Post, right? Even though Henry Louis Gates' name was on it, right? Once it was no longer viable, they're like, peace out, Henry, we finna drop this, right? Black Voices, right? Which has a long history as one of the pioneering Black sites. AOL, right? Now it separated out and I think it became part of Gawker Network. And so this history is hard to keep up with because, who wants to keep the archive?
Well, as a museum guy, can I just say, to anyone listening or that it's attended this week, please save your stuff.
Yes.
Please email one of us. Like we'd be very happy to talk to you, because absolutely, historians and social scientists can only write the stories based on things that have been saved and recovered. Sometimes that's digital, sometimes it's paper in a box, sometimes it's an interview, but yes, please, a plea, save your stuff.
It should be the responsibility as well of computer companies, etc.
Yes.
to fund this, to curate. There's so much out there that we are, number one, have not gotten access to, or that we're in jeopardy of losing, that could require legions of people and hours and time that we won't get by just folks send them a box of stuff in the mail, right?
Hey, I just want to look at our time. It's about 2:28, and we only got to a fraction of the question. So I'm going to ask each of you to do like a rapid fire, like 5-second answer. All right? Challenge. Okay. Are you ready?
Yes.
Do either of you think that a Black-owned social network along the lines of Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or you mentioned Afronet is possible?
You mean Black Planet?
Did I say the wrong name? Sorry, Black Planet.
No, you didn't. I'm asking the person. Like we've seen it, but
but it also went away, right?
No, the economics of scale and attention mean that. And plus the belief that Black people are always on to the next new thing, right? That means that these things have a limited time and space. Like there is no eternal in the world of the internet. So we'll see.
It's going to require a lot of capital. That's the missing element. That's why things went away, disappeared, was that lack of access to capital to sustain. If we want something like that again, it's going to require that level of, having billions of dollars to burn, like a Facebook, behind what it is.
Like an Uber, right?
Speaking of, another rapid fire. We got to go quick. It's 2:29. 5-second answer. Easy, right? How will advances in AI, artificial intelligence, affect Black people in the United States?
Badly.
André.
Badly.
Why?
Because we're, again, Black technical objects. And so the beliefs about Blackness in Western society inevitably get built into the technologies, including AI, machine learning, and natural language processing that are inflicted upon us. Boom.
Boom. Charlton.
That train left the station 50 years ago. It's not turning back.
Okay. Thank you for brief answers. Last one before I wrap up here. Just invite you, André, 5-10 seconds. Just if there's one sort of parting thought that you wanted to leave with our group today, what would it be?
That popular expressions of Blackness online are just as valuable as the canonical texts of Baldwin or Marcus Garvey, right? Twerking videos are just as important as Black girls' code camps because they all express a heterogeneous Blackness, and we should value it all.
Amen. Charlton, same question. If there's one parting thought you wanted to leave our audience with today, quickly, what would it be?
Focus on, enjoy any kind of expressions of Black ingenuity, Black creativity. It will empower you. It will give you joy. So do it.
Excellent. Amen to both of you. Thank you so much. Not nearly as interesting, but cheers.
Hey, this has been a great week, Eric. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And to all the presenters, I see a lot of you in the chat. I mean, in the attendees. Thank you for all the great work that you've shown us this week.
Amen. If you guys will bear with me, we're running a little late. I do have several thank yous that I want to get through, and I'll actually invite Emma, she is ahead of me, to put up this final slide. So that is, as André mentioned, the conclusion of our session, and it's also the conclusion of our week-long webinar series. So first, I just wanted to sincerely thank both Charlton McIlwain and André Brock for sharing their totally amazing research with us and engaging in such a stimulating conversation. Thank you, gentlemen. I hope I get a chance to work with you guys again. I'd also just like to thank all of our speakers and moderators from earlier in the week who treated us to really fascinating and thought-provoking series. And we'd especially like to thank you, our online audience, for the amazing energy and level of engagement you've brought to each session. And we certainly hope that you will come back and join us for more Lemelson Center online programs in 2021. I have to thank my Lemelson Center colleagues who've helped develop and produce the webinar series. Shout outs to Arthur Demrich, Monica Smith, Joyce Beatty, and Jeff Brody. Special thanks to Kay Hawkins, who pushed through several purchase orders and contracts, and our team behind the scenes operating the Zoom Control Center, Emma Grahn, Laura Havel, and our captioner, Claire Baldy. We extend special thanks to David Coronado, Carol Dahl, the Lemelson family, and the entire team at the Lemelson Foundation for sponsoring the webinar series. Their support will allow us to develop a conference report and a white paper that will synthesize many of the great things that we have learned this week and develop a roadmap for creating a more equitable innovation ecosystem. And looking ahead, as we mentioned, after some captioning and post-production, we also plan to post the videos from this week's sessions on the Lemelson Center YouTube channel and at our event website. And again, look for us to circulate that conference report early in 2021. Finally, and thank you for bearing with me here, in 2021, the Lemelson Center will be back with more online programming. Our Innovative Live series features conversations with inventors, innovators, and entrepreneurs from diverse technical and business fields, speaking about their inspirations, successes, and challenges. Our 2021 lineup features multiple inventors from diverse backgrounds with an emphasis on adaptive sports this year and technologies of inclusion. We do not have the details finalized just yet, but please come back and check out invention.si.edu/events and follow us at SI_Invention for more details in the coming weeks. And just some quick shout outs. January 13th, we'll have our Lemelson Center 25th anniversary program where we bring back some inventors from previous programs, including Mike Augsburger, who invented an all-terrain hand cycle for wheelchair athletes, Black inventor Lonnie Johnson, best known as the inventor of the Super Soaker, but he has dozens of other patents, Dr. Tiffany Kelly, registered nurse and CEO of 2 healthcare startups, and Tim Pula, our Lemelson Center resident inventor. On Wednesday, February 10th, the program will feature Black inventor Jessica O. Matthews. She's the founder and CEO of Uncharted Power, which makes things like soccer balls, jump ropes, and street pavers that convert mechanical energy into electricity. Our Wednesday, March 10th program is called Growing Up with an Inventor. It features filmmakers Rob Lemelson and Cindy Yoon, who will share stories and clips from their documentary films about their inventor fathers, Jerome Lemelson and Dr. Inbe Yoon. Wednesday, April 14th, that program will feature Marilyn Hamilton. She's the co-inventor of the Quickie wheelchair, which is used by wheelchair athletes across several sports. And then on Wednesday, May 12th, our program will feature Paralympic downhill skier and accessibility advocate Sarah Will, in conversation with Mike Schultz, who is the inventor of the Moto Knee, the VersaFoot, and several other prosthetics for elite athletes. So again, check us out at invention.si.edu/events for more information. Whew. Okay, come check us out. And so let me just wrap up again by saying thanks to everyone who participated in our webinar series, Black Inventors and Innovators, New Perspectives. We hope you'll join us again for a future Lemelson Center program. And I just wish you all can stay safe and have a great Thanksgiving. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.